When you talk about horror, most people think about the horror greats that are directors and rattle off Carpenter, Romero, and Cronenberg, and Craven. But there's also the literary world, and so many films have been based on horror books. Like, don't forget about H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe, since those guys have had so many of their works put on screen. But no one can compete with one man, Stephen King. This guy and horror are pretty much synonymous, and a great deal of his catalog has been adapted into film. So today, we're going to go through the timeline of theatrical King adaptations. The first ever full feature film based on a Stephen King work was Carrie from 1976 by Brian De Palma. It was based on the book with the same title from 1974 and is actually extremely faithful to the novel, with some calling it one of the best adaptations of one of his works. It was a big hit, making around $34 million on a $2 million budget, and even earned 2 Oscar nominations. Of course, then the floodgates opened, and in 1980 there was The Shining by none other than Stanley Kubrick. It's one of the more controversial of the adaptations due to how much King himself dislikes it, since it changes so much of the book's contents. At the time, it received poor reviews and was even nominated for 2 Razzies. And even though it was profitable, it was considered to be a rather big disappointment. Over time, though, it's grown in status and is now thought to be one of the best horror films of all time. And even King has softened to it. By this point, King adaptations were starting to grow in popularity, and next up, in '82, there was the anthology film Creepshow, which was only partially an adaptation. It consisted of several short stories in anthology form, and 2 of them were from previous works. Weeds, a short story that ran in Cavalier magazine in 1976, was turned into The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill, and The Crate, a story that was first published in Gallery magazine in '79, was adapted as The Crate, keeping its name. I guess I should point out that Gallery is a nudie mag that was a strong competition for Playboy at one point, and both of these recreations would be very faithful to the source material, with only minor changes to the original stories. Directed by the legendary George Romero, it was a nice hit, earning $21 million against a budget of 8, and became a franchise of sorts, with sequels that we'll discuss, and an unofficial spin-off tale with Tales from the Dark Side, and an official one in Creepshow, the TV show, currently still running. The following year, another big-name entry arrived with Cujo, adapting the 1981 novel of the same name. It was directed by Louis Teague, who had some experience with killer animals since he had just done Alligator in '80, and starred Dee Wallace, fresh off of E.T. and The Howling. It had a pretty major change to the novel, giving it a happy ending as opposed to the book's more bleak finale. It only cost $6 million to make and turned a healthy profit, earning $21 million, even if the reviews were fairly mixed. '83 was a big year for King works, because a little later on was the release of The Dead Zone. This one was based on a novel from 1979 and had another legend at the helm, David Cronenberg. It would star Christopher Walken and Martin Sheen, and was extremely true to the book. In fact, it's considered one of the more faithful adaptations of one of his novels, even though there are minor alterations. Its release wasn't as strong, although most critic reviews were pretty positive, but it had a little higher price tag at around $10 million and only earned $20 million at the box office, softer numbers than either Cujo or Creepshow. Also in '83 was another one from a big name in horror, and it was Christine, which was the first time that a film came out in the same year as the book it was adapting, since the novel Christine came out earlier on in '83. John Carpenter himself took up the directing duties, and was the first film he did after the disappointing box office of The Thing. It made some pretty big changes to the book, making the car evil on its own as opposed to being possessed by the spirit of a previous owner, and King wasn't really a fan, saying it was one of the adaptations of his work that bored him. The reviews were decent though, but it didn't really make waves, as it also had a budget of around 10 million and also brought in just over 20. The first adaptation of 1984 was the first feature-length film on here that was stretched out from a short story, and it's Children of the Corn. It was the first film for Fritz Kirsch, although it was also probably his biggest project. The original short was published in an issue of Penthouse back in '77 and then collected in Night Shift, and was only around 16 pages long. So as you can imagine, the film version adds quite a bit of story to it, even though the parts that are brought over from the story are somewhat accurate, even if the ending isn't as dark, like, at all. It was a lower budget than most of the others and is said to have only cost around $1 million, so even though it only brought in 14 million, lower than the last couple that we talked about, it made a bigger profit. So there were around 100 sequels. The second and final adaptation of 1984 was a bigger name, as it was Firestarter, which was a version of the novel from 1980, again with the same name. Mark Lester was the director, coming off of Class of 1984, and it stayed pretty close to the book, even if it stripped things down considerably and lost a lot of complexity. It was an early role for Drew Barrymore and also featured David Keith, Martin Sheen, and George C. Scott, and was budgeted at around 12 million. The reviews were pretty negative though, and it only brought in around 17 million in sales, and was considered a disappointment at the time. King himself really disliked it, calling it one of the worst of the bunch and flavorless, and even argued with Lester about it. Going into 1985 now, and we're looking at another mixed bag anthology, In Cat's Eye. This one was also directed by Louis Teague and had 3 stories, 2 of which were adaptations, and a third one was an original story written for the film. The adapted pair were Quitters Incorporated, from a short that ran in the Night Shift collection in '78 and was exclusive to that, and The Ledge, also from Night Shift, but that one had originally been featured in Penthouse magazine back in 1976. Both shorts are pretty close to their written form, and the film did okay, earning 13 million against a 7 million budget. 85's other film was an odd adaptation since it was Silver Bullet. And it's not weird for the movie, but the book it was based on was an illustrated novella called Cycle of the Werewolf. As opposed to a traditional book, this was much shorter and featured artwork by comic artist Bernie Wrightson. The film was by Dan Attias, his debut, but he'd mainly just do TV after this. But I mean a lot of TV. Like, the dude seems to always be working. It had Corey Haim and Gary Busey in it, and also cost around 7 million, but then brought in around $12 million, a modest profit. There were 2 King movies in '86, and one was the first one that wasn't a horror film, with Stand By Me. This was based on a novella from the Different Seasons collection called The Body, and was directed by meathead Rob Reiner, and this won't be his last King adaptation. It's a dramatic film and had Will Wheaton, Corey Feldman, River Phoenix, and Jerry O'Connell in it, and was a big hit. It only cost around 8 million to make and earned over 50 million, and was nominated for an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay and 2 Golden Globes, although it didn't win any. On the polar end of the spectrum from that one was the other '86 entry, Maximum Overdrive. This was adapted by King himself, who not only wrote the screenplay, but also directed. It was taken from his story Trucks, which first ran in Cavalier magazine way back in 1973, and then was in the Night Shift collection, and is a very loose adaptation. The movie has Emilio Estevez at the height of his powers, but was not really loved. The reviews were terrible, and it was even nominated for a couple of Razzies, with King being put up for Worst Director. It bombed as well, not even making back its $9 million budget. King would then go on to disown the movie and called it a part of his learning process and promised to never direct again. '87 gave us our first sequel on this list, and it was the follow-up to Creepshow, Creepshow 2. This one only had 3 segments, and only one of them would be an adaptation, with the other 2 being original works. The one that was previously in print form was The Raft, from a story of that name that was first run in Gallery magazine in '82 and reprinted in the Skeleton Crew collection. The film version would be mostly pretty accurate, although with a tweaked ending, and whereas Romero would return to do the screenplay, it was directed by Michael Gornick. It was less expensive than the first, running only $3.5 million, although it was originally planned to be higher, and when it was cut down, they eliminated 2 other stories. This smaller cost made it brighter when it didn't make as much as the first, bringing in only $14 million, which then represented a nice profit. The other '87 release was wildly different, since it was The Running Man. This was from a novel with that name from 1982 that was written under King's pen name of Richard Bachman, a name he used to circumvent publishers' rules that an author should only put out 1 work a year so as not to oversaturate the market. The film version, directed by Paul Michael Glaser, starred then superstar Arnold Schwarzenegger, and essentially only took the name and core concept of the book and changed most everything else. The movie is very far removed from its inspiration, and King didn't care for it at all, particularly the casting of Arnold, who he said doesn't fit the book character whatsoever. It was more expensive than most and ran $27 million to make, and only earned around $38 million, which made it a success, albeit a small one. Weirdly, there were no King adaptations in '88, but in '89 there was one with Pet Sematary, from the novel that was released in 1983. King did the screenplay, and it was directed by Mary Lambert, the first film on this roster to be directed by a woman. It was fairly accurate to the book, mainly because King was actively involved in the filming, although there were elements that were glazed over or dropped for time. It was made for around $11.5 million and was a surprise hit, making close to $60 million, even though the reviews were mediocre at best. There was a sequel that came a few years later, although that was not adapting anything. There were a couple of releases in 1990, perhaps making up for the lack of films in the past couple of years, but the first was another anthology with Tales from the Dark Side, the movie. It was a theatrical spin-off of the TV show that was essentially a TV version of Creepshow, and once again featured 3 stories, and one of them was a King adaptation. That story was The Cat from Hell, a short that ran the first half in Cavalier magazine in 1977, but had a weird history since it was part of a contest in which a reader could complete the story. That was then published in Gent magazine, yet yes, another nudie mag, but later on, King would release a version that was fully written by him, and this is the version that is adapted in the film. It was another mild success since it earned $16 million against a budget of only $6 million, and a sequel was planned but never happened. Also in '90 was Graveyard Shift, another full-length feature based on a short story, this one from the 1970s short that ran in Cavalier and was later placed in Night Shift. This one was a more under-the-radar affair, and Brad Dourif was in it, but the story had to be drastically expanded upon to turn into a full film. But the small portion that's from the story is pretty accurate. It was made for around $10 million, but got pretty negative reviews, and sits at a whopping 0% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, although that's only from 7 reviews. But it did make a little bit of money and opened at number 1, bringing in $11.5 million. The final entry of 1990 was the biggest of the bunch, and it was Misery, Rob Reiner's return to King Adaptations. This was based on the book called Misery from '87 and featured James Caan, Kathy Bates, and Lauren Bacall, and it kept pretty close to the source material with some minor changes, like the fact that in the book, Annie cuts off Paul's foot with an axe instead of just hobbling him. It was a massive success, earning $60 million plus on a budget of around $20, and more importantly, it received nearly unanimous positive reviews and won an Oscar for Kathy Bates' performance, as well as a Golden Globe. King himself is a big fan as well and places it in his top 10 of all of his film adaptations. 91 was another year with no films, but in 92 there was one that can probably not be on here, and it's The Lawnmower Man. This was by Brett Leonard and had Pierce Brosnan and Jeff Fahey in it, and claimed to be based on the short story called The Lawnmower Man from 1975 that was in an issue of Cavalier and then placed in Night Shift. The film not only doesn't really adapt the story, but it's a completely different kind of story altogether. Whereas the short is about a supernatural demonic lawnmower and its large naked acolyte, the film is about cyberspace. It was originally marketed as Stephen King's The Lawnmower Man, but the author was so flustered with how little it resembled his tale, he sued to have his name removed, and won. And then won further damages after they put his name on the home release. Even with those issues, it was a big hit since it only cost $10 million and ended up raking on $32 million in the US, but a whopping $150 million worldwide. 1993 started strong with George Romero returning to King territory with The Dark Half. This one was based on the book from '89 that was a sort of a fictionalized take on King abandoning his Bachman pseudonym. Like Pet Sematary, it would mostly just adapt the book, although it didn't have time to really get into more of the lore elements, but it's very similar. The reviews were alright, like mostly positive, but it didn't make a dent financially, only earning around $10 million around a budget of $15. A little later in the year, there was a second release with Needful Things, based on a novel from 1991. It was directed by Fraser Heston, son of Charlton Heston, and was the only film that he made that didn't have his dad in it. The cast was strong with Ed Harris, Max von Sydow, Bonnie Bedelia, and J.T. Walsh, but the story was missing way too many elements of the book, which was 690 pages, a little too long to be jammed into a single feature film. Because of this, most of the negative reviews focused on the story, but liked the performances, and the budget isn't known, but it only made $15 million, and with that cast, I have to assume the price tag was a bit larger with this one. There was another change of pace in 1994, another more dramatic entry with The Shawshank Redemption. This was based on a 1982 novella called Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, which was first released in different seasons, the same collection that The Body was featured in. It was by Frank Darabont, whose very first directing was a short film based on King's story, The Woman in the Room. This had another heavy hitter cast with Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman, and a bigger budget at $25 million, and the adaptation was pretty close, with the biggest variation being the alteration of the character of Red to a black man. The interesting bit here is that it was initially a bomb, only doing $16 million in its run, even though it was nearly universally acclaimed. But then, it was nominated for 7 Oscars, including Best Picture, although it didn't win any, but mainly because it was the same year that Pulp Fiction and Forrest Gump were out and swept everything. But, based on the awards buzz, they put it back in theaters, and it cleaned up and grossed $73 million worldwide. King has gone on record saying that this, along with Stand By Me, are his favorite adaptations of any of his works. In '95, another legendary horror director took a crack at the King with The Mangler. Tobe Hooper took care of this one, and it was based on a short story from 1972 that also ran in Cavalier and would later show up in Night Shift. Again, since it was a short, they had to beef up the narrative with a number of new elements, but it ended up being a pretty big disappointment. The reviews were pretty harsh, and it brought in just under $2 million, but somehow managed to inspire a pair of sequels. The other '95 release was another more dramatic one with Dolores Claiborne. It would bring Kathy Bates back into King territory and also star Jennifer Jason Leigh. The director was Taylor Hackford, the guy who made An Officer and a Gentleman and adapted the novel from 1992. Even though this didn't quite get the awards cred that Misery got, it did pretty well since the budget was $13 million and it ended up earning around $46. The reviews were great as well, and Bates said that it was one of her favorite performances. Beyond that, Time magazine has tagged it as being one of the 10 best King film adaptations. The only release for '96 was back in the horror world with Thinner, which was an adaptation of the book from 1984, another one of the Bachman books. Tom Holland would direct this one and featured Robert Burke in a variety of fat suits in order to portray the character. It ran around $8 million to make and did okay in its release, earning around $15 million, although it was not that well regarded, with the majority of reviews being pretty harsh on it. Oh, and by the way, Thinner was the book that revealed Bachman as king. A bookstore employee had noted how similar the two authors' writing styles were, and did some digging and found copyright evidence to link the two, and sent a letter to King saying what he found, only to get a phone call from the man himself to confirm that he was indeed correct. In '97, there was a film that debuted on HBO before getting a small theatrical run in '98, and it was The Night Flyer. This one was based on a short story that was in an anthology book from '88 called Prime Evil, New Stories by the Masters of Modern Horror, and then was collected into '93 Nightmares and Dreamscapes. The short story was only 40 pages long, so quite a bit had to be added to flesh the story out more, and had Miguel Ferrer as the main character. There was a plan to have this released in theaters, but a crowded schedule pushed it back, and in order to try to recoup costs, it was sold off to HBO to air there. As such, there's not really any box office information to speak of, except the small amount that it made from a handful of theaters it played on in the limited run. The next year, 1998, gave us another highbrow release with Apt Pupil. This one was directed by known creep Bryan Singer and was an adaptation of Apt Pupil, Summer of Corruption, which was originally from different seasons. And keep in mind, that book had 4 stories in it, and this is the 3rd of them that's been adapted. Oddly, the 4th story, The Breathing Method, has never made it to a film, even though they tried repeatedly. This was made for $14 million, and during filming, there was a lawsuit filed by underage actors stating that they were made to strip naked for a shower scene, but no criminal charges were filed, and the suit was dismissed with insufficient evidence. The reviews weren't great, and it kind of bombed, only bringing in around $9 million. The film is fairly different than the book, with the biggest difference being the ending, which is far more subtle, with less of a body count in the film. Okay, boss, let's talk about 1999, since that was when The Green Mile was released. It was another big deal production and based on a novel from 1996, and was told in an interesting way. It was put out in 6 different chapters, with a new one coming out each month. Afterwards, a version featuring the whole story would be released as well. The film version was once again handled by Frank Darabont and brought Tom Hanks in to headline. This had a higher budget than most of the ones on this list so far, since it had a price tag of around $60 million, but boy did it pay off. It made $137 million in the US and $150 million elsewhere for a total of close to $300 million. It also found great critical acclaim and was nominated for 4 Oscars and a Golden Globe. The streak of less horror-oriented adaptations continued in 2001 with Hearts in Atlantis. This one was taken from another collection called Hearts in Atlantis that collected several novellas and some short stories. This was one of the novellas, and the collection was weird because all of the shorts were connected in a way, and even though there's a novella in the book called Hearts in Atlantis, the movie Hearts in Atlantis was an adaptation of a story called Low Men in Yellow Coats, and is somewhat connected to the Dark Tower saga. The movie would star Anthony Hopkins and Anton Yelchin, and even with international ticket sales, the film barely made back its $31 million budget, and was met with mixed opinions. Nothing happened in '02, but in '03 there was a wild one with Dreamcatcher. This was from Lawrence Kasdan, the dude that made Body Heat and Wyatt Earp, and was based on the novel from 2001. It had a pretty big cast with Tom Jane, Jason Lee, Morgan Freeman, and Tom Sizemore, and had a beefy budget of $76 million. And when it came out, King said that it was one of the best adaptations of one of his works. But it was almost completely panned by critics and flopped pretty hard, with the worldwide take barely reaching $75 million. Kasdan actually stated that the reaction to the film hurt his career as he didn't work for a few years after. Going into 2004 now, and we have Secret Window. This one was based on Secret Window, Secret Garden, another novella from a collection called 4 Past Midnight from 1990, the same one that The Langoliers was published. It's often been compared to The Dark Half in a way, and was directed by David Koepp, director of Stir of Echoes. This had Johnny Depp and John Turturro in it, and hey, speaking of The Dark Half, Timothy Hutton. It ran $40 million to make, and even though the reviews were mostly fairly harsh, it did quite well, earning $92 million, making it a nice success, even if it differed quite a bit from the printed version, featuring a much darker ending than the book one. The other one from 2004 is Riding the Bullet from Mick Garris, and this would be the first King feature adaptation for him, even though he had previously done Sleepwalkers, which was an original screenplay by King, and the TV miniseries of The Stand and The Shining. It was based on a novella from 2000 that was the world's first mass-market ebook, and sold for a mere $2.50. It didn't really get a wide release and only screened in a handful of theaters where it underperformed, only making around $250,000 worldwide. Both 2005 and 6 were totally King-free, but that changed in 2007 with the release of 1408. It was by Swedish filmmaker Mikael Hafström and was adapted from a short of the same name that was originally released in 1999 as an audiobook in a collection called Blood and Smoke. It was said that the stories there would only ever exist in audiobook form and wouldn't be done in a print version, although this one ended up in a later collection called Everything's Eventual from 2002. Again, it has to add some material to the short to be at feature length, and differs from the story, and how drastically it does, I guess, depends on which ending you're watching, considering that there's like 4 of them. It cost around $25 million, and it was a nice hit, bringing in $133 million, and had mostly nice reviews. Frank Darabont returned to King Country later that year with The Mist, the first one he did that you'd call straight horror. This one was from a novella that ran as a part of an anthology book called Dark Forces, but then later had a version appear in the Skeleton Crew collection, although in a slightly altered form. It had a budget of $18 million and a pretty big cast that included Tom Jane again and Marcia Gay Harden. The biggest alteration it would make to the source material is the ending, which has now become one of the most discussed aspects of this movie. The book had a way more ambiguous and open-ended finale and just ends with our characters headed off into the mist. And the movie, well, does something else. Reviews were nice and it did pretty well, earning just under $60 million, and the DVD has a version of the film in black and white, which actually enhances the film quite a bit in my opinion. 2008 was another year off, but in 2009 there was Dolan's Cadillac, which was a sort of crime thriller. This was from yet another novella, but another with a weird publication history. It was first published in Castle Rock, the official King newsletter, in short installments in 1985. Later, it was collected in one place in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. The film was a direct-to-video production, and shockingly, I think it's the first one on this list to be exclusively for the home market, although I guess like the Night Flyer could be on there as well. Although that did get some theater play. For the first time, there was a gap of more than 2 years since the next one didn't arrive until 2013, and it's our first remake on this roster with Carrie. This was actually the third version of the story since there was a TV movie adaptation back in 2002, but this was another theatrical run. It had Kimberly Peirce as the director, only the second female director here, and placed Chloe Grace Moretz in that lead role. It pretty much just covers the same ground as the original, although there were minor changes like adding cyberbullying to update things and some other little tweaks like that final scare. It was mostly called okay, with many critics commenting on the unnecessary nature of it, but it did pretty well, earning around 85 million against a budget of 30. There was no skip year here, and 2014 had a pair of releases, and the first was another straight-to-video release called Mercy. This was an adaptation of the short story Grandma that was first run in Weird Book magazine back in 1984 and was later collected in Skeleton Crew. It had previously been adapted on television on an episode of The Twilight Zone, but this was the first feature film version. It was a Blumhouse production, but actually went a bit unnoticed amidst their other more high-profile releases. The other one from 2014 was A Good Marriage, which did get a very limited theatrical run, but was mostly made for video on demand. It was from a novella from 2010 that ran in a collection called Full Dark, No Stars. King himself handled the screenplay on this one, and it got a bit of controversy when King stated that it was vaguely based on the BTK killer, Dennis Rader. Rader's daughter denounced the film and said that King was exploiting her father's victims with his story. But ultimately, it didn't matter much since the film came and went, and the reviews were mostly pretty negative. We skipped 2015, but in 2016, there was another release that ended up going to video on demand and getting a very small theatrical run, and it's Cell. This was by the director of Paranormal Activity 2 and adapted the novel of the same name from 2006. Originally, it was going to be handled by Eli Roth, but a difference of creative opinions stopped that from happening. The film version had John Cusack and Samuel Jackson both returning to King territory after 1408 and features a drastically different ending. Like The Mist, the novel ends ambiguously, yet the film version instead ends things on a rather downbeat note. Okay, here's the big one. The year 2017 was just full of King. And it all started with what should have been the biggest deal, The Dark Tower. And man, where to even start here? This was a loose adaptation of a series of novels and stories that began all the way back in 1982 under the Dark Tower umbrella, and essentially ties together a good deal of other stories in the overall King universe. The film was meant to be the launching of a whole franchise and ongoing story that would extend to several different continuations, and at various points, J.J. Abrams and Ron Howard would be attached. It was very expensive, costing around $66 million, but the critics and the fans hated it, being really confused as to what it was trying to do in terms of being an adaptation or a sequel or what. It did fine, I guess, and earned $113 million worldwide, but was considered a big disappointment. The plans for any follow-ups were scrapped. Also in 2017 was another big one, although one that had been done before, with It. This was previously covered back in 1990 as a TV miniseries, but this was the first theatrical go at it. The plan was to split it up into two features, and this was the first. Directed by Andy Muschietti, it was of course a version of the book from 1986, one of King's longest reads. As opposed to the book and the mini, it changes things up by skipping the notion of going back and forth from the present to the past, as well as moving the timeline forward so that the past events take place in the 80s instead of the 50s. This had a moderate budget of around $40 million and was a massive sensation, raking in over $700 million worldwide. A much smaller scope adaptation also came that same year with Gerald's Game, which was made exclusively for Netflix by Mike Flanagan. This one was an adaptation of the book from 1992 and was originally intended as a companion piece to Dolores Claiborne, although that aspect was reduced while writing. This one got very nice reviews for the story and also for the performance of Carla Gugino, who was alone on screen for a large portion of the time. It also introduced people to the word degloving, and no thanks to it for that. The final one from 17 was a dark little flick called 1922, which again starred Tom Jane, who I guess has a thing for King works. This was based on a novella that was in Full Dark, No Stars from 2010, the same collection that A Good Marriage was from. Like Gerald's Game, this was also made for Netflix, and also like that one, was mostly well reviewed. 2018 was a skip year, but there was another bunch in 2019, and the first of which was a remake with another go at Pet Sematary. This version was taken on by the guys who made Starry Eyes and made some significant changes to the source material, most notably the changing of the main antagonist in a way. Even though the reviews weren't that great and the perception of the film was that it was pretty disappointing, it did make quite a bit of money. The budget was just over $20 million and it earned around $113 worldwide. 19 also had Netflix continue its run of King adaptations with In the Tall Grass. This one was based on a novella from 2012 that was originally run in 2 parts in Esquire magazine and then later collected in Full Throttle. This one is unique here since it's not just a King adaptation, since the original work was written by both King and Joe Hill, King's son. Hill had become a notable writer himself, and this was their second collaboration together, and the film version will be handled by Vincenzo Natali, the man who did Cube. Unlike the other Netflix films, this one didn't get as praised as highly, although it did get decent reviews and remained very faithful to the original work. Mike Flanagan returned to the King well in 19 for a theatrical film with Dr. Sleep. This was an adaptation of the novel from 2013 and was a rare thing for King, a sequel to one of his own works, as it was a continuation from The Shining. Now, the film version had the unique challenge in that it had to act as a sequel to the novel, as well as working as a follow-up to the Kubrick film as well. Not an easy task, given the alterations to the ending of the story there, but it manages it quite well. Ewan McGregor would step into the role of Danny Torrance, and the budget was pretty strong at around $50 million. The reviews were pretty strong as well, and it did okay with ticket sales, like grossing $72 million, but it was seen as a letdown when put up against the other King-based films of that year. The last film of 19 was the second part of the adaptation of It, with It Chapter 2. It had the entire crew from the first one returning to end the story and had a beefier budget of $80 million and a monster runtime of nearly 3 hours. This was not as lauded as the first chapter, and critics were a bit harsher with it, although it did make money, although not nearly the behemoth that the first one was. It still earned $473 million though, and is getting a TV series follow-up. There was one entry from 2020, and it's going back to remake land with Children of the Corn, this one directed by Kurt Wimmer, director of Equilibrium. This is actually the third take on the story, since there was a made-for-TV remake back in 2009, and this one can barely be called a remake. It was actually said that it would be a new adaptation of King's story that had almost nothing to do with the 1984 film, but it actually has very little to do with the original story as well, outside of the concept of children killing adults. This was intended for a theatrical release, but the pandemic altered those plans, and the film was delayed, but eventually it was given a small run, but then sent to streaming. After nothing happening in 2021, 22 gave us another remake with Firestarter, once again based on that book from 1980. This one was also handled by Blumhouse and was given a $12 million budget and stayed fairly true to both the novel and the previous film, and only minor alterations. One interesting aspect to the film was the score, as it was by John Carpenter, a minor in-joke as he was intended to direct the original film at one point. It had a dual debut, screening in theaters, but also streaming on Peacock, and was considered a failure, grossing only $15 million. It got a bit of press later on as the Razzies nominated Ryan Kiera Armstrong for Worst Actress, a move that was heavily criticized considering that, she's just a kid, so they ended up rescinding the nomination. In the same year, there was a non-remake film that was another Netflix release with Mr. Harrigan's Phone. This one was based on the novella from 2020 that showed up in a collection called If It Bleeds, making it the most recent King work here to be made into a film. It was done by John Lee Hancock, a man mostly known for sports films like The Rookie and The Blind Side, and this one was not well loved, with most reviews saying that it missed the point of the original story. In 2023, there was one film, and I guess sort of a remake, with The Boogeyman. This was taken from a short story from 1973 that ran in Cavalier and then was collected in Night Shift. And it did get put on screen before, but as a short film that was released on VHS with another short called The Woman in the Room. This was a full-length take on it, and yeah, it's drastically removed from the source. It was intended to be released directly to Hulu, but after some strong test screenings, they opted to give it a theatrical run instead, and that paid off as it brought in around $82 million against a budget of $35 million. Reviews were okay as well, although none were exceptionally flattering, and fan reaction was pretty negative. The final film on this list technically isn't out yet, but it is done, and it's another remake with Salem's Lot. This is from the novel from 1975, and it was already done multiple times, but only as TV miniseries. Its first adaptation was back in 1979, and another was done in 2004, but this would be the first theatrical attempt. What's nuts is that this film was shot back in 2021. It was meant to be released in September of 22, but then it was pushed back to April of 23, but then was removed from the schedule entirely with no set date. In October of 23, it was announced that it would skip theaters and debut on streaming, going straight to HBO Max, but no date was given. And as of March of this year, it was said that it will show up there sometime this year, but the date is still unknown. Also, keep in mind that there's other adaptations, and I'll cover those in another way in the future, but there's adaptations for television, TV miniseries, movies based on original King screenplays, short films, TV series, and also sequels to some of these films. Hell, a few of them had entire franchises spring out of them. Plus, there's future adaptations, some coming sooner than others. But you can expect versions of The Life of Chuck, The Monkey, Billy Summers, another take on Christine, Elevation, Fairy Tale, From a Buick 6, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, The Little Green God of Agony, Another Running Man, Throttle, and The Long Walk. All of those are in some form of development. So there you have it, the entire timeline of theatrical King adaptations. As I said, we're going to cover other versions of this in the future. We'll get to those other adaptations on another video coming up. Let me know which other ones you'd like to see done. Let me know which of these was your favorite, which King adaptations you really enjoyed, which ones you thought were the most accurate. Tell me that in the comments below. And of course, if you like this video, hit that like button. If you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and hit the little bell to get notified when new videos are coming out. And of course, check out the Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support this channel like these guys right here do. I appreciate that, and I also appreciate you coming back to keep on watching these videos. And I'll see you very shortly for another great one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.